On May the 5th, the International Maritime Organization released a fairly staggering new estimate, suggesting that the ongoing shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz is now costing the global economy roughly $14 billion every single day. In the days since, Goldman Sachs has warned that global oil inventories could fall to just 98 days of demand by the end of the month. S&P Global has clocked the fastest inventory drain rate ever recorded at 5.5 million barrels per day, and Chevron CEO Mike Wirth has become the first major oil executive to publicly describe physical shortages as, quote, imminent. For context, $14 billion per day works out at roughly $5.1 trillion a year, broadly equivalent to losing the entire German economy every year for as long as this drags on. So in this video, we're going to explain where that $14 billion figure actually comes from, why Goldman's 98-day threshold matters so much, and why Trump's so-called Project Freedom has so far failed to reopen the strait. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So let's start by explaining what's actually happening at Hormuz and where the $14 billion estimate comes from. For context, the Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman through which roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day moved before the war, about a fifth of global supply. Today, that figure is reportedly closer to 2 million barrels per day, meaning around 18 million barrels of physical oil simply isn't moving. The IMO's $14 billion per day figure is essentially a composite. It captures the direct cost of the missing oil supply, the cost of rerouting tankers around Africa, which adds something like 30 days to a typical voyage, and the explosion in war risk insurance premiums, which are now reportedly around 10 times their normal level. It also factors in the sheer human cost. Roughly 20,000 seafarers are apparently stranded, and around 2,000 vessels can't transit at all. S&P Global, meanwhile, has put the global inventory drain rate at 5.5 million barrels per day, which they describe as the fastest ever recorded. However, the more alarming number here is arguably Goldman's. In a research note published on May the 5th, Goldman Sachs warned that global oil inventories could fall to just 98 days of demand cover by the end of May. For context, 100 days has historically been treated as a kind of crisis threshold, and every prior breach of that level has triggered a sustained price spike of more than 40%. OECD commercial inventories are already at 5-year lows, China is reportedly drawing down its strategic reserves at an accelerating pace, and Indian refiners are said to be rationing intake. This is presumably why Chevron's Mike Wirth has now used the word, quote, imminent when describing physical shortages, apparently the first major oil executive to do so. Forecasters at FGE Nexan ECA are now reportedly modeling $150 oil if the conflict persists, with a $200 worst-case scenario. So what about the military response? Well, this is where things get noticeably harder for Washington. Trump's Project Freedom, which deployed roughly 15,000 personnel and multiple carrier groups to escort tankers through the strait, has so far produced fairly limited results. According to reporting, just 2 ships have transited in the first 48 hours of the operation, against a pre-war baseline of more than 120 transits per day. It's worth noting that U.S. forces have apparently sunk 6 Iranian fast boats in the process, but Iran has responded by launching a missile attack on the UAE's Fujairah port, which is the main bypass terminal that was supposed to take pressure off Hormuz. UAE schools have moved to remote learning through May the 8th, and Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf told state media, quote, "We haven't even begun yet on strait operations." Treasury Secretary Bessent, meanwhile, has reportedly accused China of, in effect, funding terrorism via its continued purchases of Iranian crude. So what does $5 trillion of annualized destruction actually do to the global economy? Well, the OECD's standing rule of thumb is that every $10 sustained increase in the oil price knocks roughly 0.4% off global GDP. With Brent now reportedly around $111 against a pre-war baseline closer to $70, that's a $41 sustained increase, implying something like 1.6% of global GDP being destroyed. The IMF has separately modeled that if the war drags into 2027, global growth slows to around 2% and inflation rises to roughly 5.8%. The pain is, of course, not evenly distributed. Parts of Southeast Asia have reportedly moved to 4-day work weeks. Several African countries are rationing fuel. European airlines are canceling routes, and U.S. gasoline has reportedly hit $4.48 a gallon, despite the country's relative insulation through domestic production. Ultimately, whether the $14 billion per day figure becomes a footnote or the defining number of this decade depends almost entirely on whether the strait reopens before Goldman's 98-day inventory threshold is actually breached, and on whether Iran chooses to escalate beyond the bypass infrastructure it's already shown it can hit. For now, though, the gap between the scale of what the IMO is describing and the way mainstream markets appear to be pricing it remains, frankly, one of the more remarkable disconnects in recent financial memory.